Keir Starmer made a big fist of releasing 1,700 people after they'd served just 40% of their tariff. And we also know that there's another tranche set to be released, I think, in a week or two, though my guests will tell me exactly when that is, but I remember that from last time. So we know there's going to be more people. By the way, in England, there's no numbers being given to us about how many of those reoffended and are now back behind bars. In Scotland, they did a survey of that. 10% of the people they released early are back inside, proving that they're not solving anything by doing this. Prison gangs are ruling the roost. There's violence beyond. I mean, a lot of you might go, well, they're in prison, you know, so what? But you don't deserve to be intimidated and beaten and stabbed and in one case shot just because you're in prison, right? The gangs are, there's religious gangs, there's drugs gangs, and there's postcode gangs, even in a prison, postcode gangs. So if you're not in a gang, then you're in big trouble. What do the prison guards do? How do they control this? They're getting injured by these gangs as well. But why is it that our prisons are so hard to control and so hard to turn into a force for good, which is what they should be? Well, joining me to discuss these matters is Steve Gillan, who's the General Secretary of the Prison Officers Association. Steve, it's great to see you. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. The state of our prisons, it's something that we sort of brush past, but it is getting absolutely desperate, isn't it?
Petri, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me on. And your introduction there about mental illness is quite ironic, because there's many prisoners, actually, that aren't diverted away from prison in the first instance, and it should be, and that would keep some of the pressure off the healthcare departments in prisons, and indeed prison officers who are not trained in mental illness. And by default, some of these poor souls are coming to prison when they need help. They're not getting help in the community because there's no foundation since Care in the Community came in, which was an absolute failure.
A joke.
But in relation to the prisons crisis, you're right to say there's been a prisons crisis brewing for the last 14 years, and a lot of it was down to the last government, actually, who ceased to fund it. They got rid of 100,000 years of experience of prison officers, all in the name of austerity, and sometimes you reap what you sow. So I'm critical of all political parties, actually, because Labour blame the Tories for the state of our prisons. Tories blame Labour for the state of our prisons, and that's been going on for decades. And what happens is nothing changes.
Why is it with the prison service that it doesn't get that attention? You don't get I don't think you have a calendar of prison officers, for example. You'd have one of firemen and women, or you'd have the police officers. They seem to be a bit more glamorous. It seems to be the Cinderella service in a way.
In many respects, you're absolutely right, and there's probably a rational reason for that, because many members of the public meet their doctors, they meet their nurses, they meet the firefighters, they meet the police officers, and they meet the teachers. Unless they're committing an offence, they don't meet a prison officer.
True.
So it goes under the radar, but it's a very important public service because the taxpayer is funding effectively a revolving door. And my union has been saying for a significant amount of time that there needs to be a serious dialogue in this country with all the political parties and experts to have a root and branch review, call it a royal commission, call it what you want. But we can't go on like this. We're bursting at the seams. The Conservatives were releasing prisoners early as well, and Labour had to do the same because there was no space left. And as a result, over a period of time, there was 3,000 assaults on my members in 2010, right? What it is today is nearly 10,000 a year assaults. So it's gone up by about 150% assaults on my members. And you talked about gangs earlier. There is gang warfare in some of our prisons, but there's gang warfare on the streets. And that doesn't necessarily go away when people come into prisons. They do have the postcode sort of gangs. And, if any of the viewers or people had a tour of Feltham Prison, which is a young offenders institution and juvenile place, there's hundreds of different gangs. I was there, you know, not so long ago, and it's impossible to try and keep some of these gangs apart, 'cause as soon as they see each other, they want to fight. And it's my members on the receiving end. Only recently at Feltham, 15 prison officers were hospitalised.
Good heavens.
Absolutely hospitalised. And they go home with life-changing injuries to the loved ones. It's totally unnecessary.
It's so interesting. Whenever I talk about prisons, there's always this belief, in a sense, or there are two beliefs. One, that why isn't it possible to stop the gangs and stop the drugs and stop all that? And the other belief is, well, whatever the prisoners, if they get beaten up, I don't care, because they're in there because they've done something bad. If you don't want to be beaten up, if you don't want to be shanked, or whatever the phrase is, then don't break the law. So it is also, it's not a system or a service that has any sympathy or empathy attached to it from the general public either.
No, get that. And in actual fact, until we have the adult conversation in this country, we'll never take the British public with us, because all political parties use the criminal justice system as a political football about who can be the toughest on crime. And you can trace that back to the Michael Howard years, prison works, then Tony Blair, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime.
But then he said hug a hoodie.
Yeah, well, well, I think that was Cameron that said that.
Oh, it was Cameron, you're absolutely right, yeah.
So in many respects, it's just a revolving door. And, you know, I've been around the prison system now for 34 years, and nothing's changed in that time, apart from the prison population increasing. And I think we've got to have that dialogue with the British public to say, look, we've got to change, we've got to do things differently. Do you know, they're even starting to do things differently. In Texas and America, some of the toughest laws probably in the world, they've recognised that prison doesn't always work, and it's expensive, and it's just a revolving door. And I'm not saying we take them out and murder them, but some of the some of the public want the pound of flesh. And I understand.
Well, they want revenge, not justice. And I also understand that.
And I understand that. As victims of crime, they must always come first. But we've got to have that dialogue to say, actually, if we actually have a different way of doing things, like, I don't see the point, quite frankly, and I've seen them, sending people to prison for 3 and 4 months.
No, I agree. I was going to come on to that, the length of sentencing as well, because that will also account for the huge recidivism rate, because there's no time to do anything.
Exactly.
But just before I get on to the sentences and the length of sentences, again, when I have this conversation with my listeners and viewers, there is a belief that is being fed that prison is like being in a hotel, that they play snooker, they get, 3 meals a day, I don't get that, they get to see a doctor straight away, I don't get that, they get free education, I don't get that, my kids don't get that. We're too soft. We're too soft in prisons, and that's why we have this repeat offending that's going on. Now, I have visited a couple of prisons, the old Victorian ones. I don't know why the rats don't leave. Frankly, if I was a rat in there, I'd have gone. They are hideous, horrible places. But of course, it's fed by people like Securicor, who are building these new prisons with open doors, and they've got little apartments and things. But that is a tiny percentage of the prison population, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I've worked at Chelmsford, which is an old Victorian jail, part of it. Some of it's a little bit more newer. I've worked at Pentonville. And some of them are grim places. So at the end of the day, look, it was this perception by the British public that prisons are cushy places.
I
can assure you they're not. They're not cushy prisons. And at the end of the day, look, I've known prisoners that act tough on the inside, and when they actually, that cell door shuts, they cry themselves to sleep. So that's the reality of things. Look, I'm not saying we should be that liberal that we shouldn't care less about what someone's done, but I actually think prisons should be reserved for real serious crimes to protect the general public. Not your sort of petty criminals who I actually think we should be doing more with to keep them out of prisons. And then the taxpayer will actually see that they're getting value for money, because prison officers, who are some of the most professional people that I've ever met and worked with, want to do a decent job, right? But there's always an analogy, isn't there? You couldn't build a Jaguar with a hammer and chisel. So the reality is, I'm just asking that we have a properly funded prison service, that we deal with rehabilitation. I mean, there's a report out recently. We're not even doing proper offending behaviour programmes because they've been cut because of budgets and different things.
And prisons also they have to modernise, don't they? I mean, there's one of my best mates, she sings in a prison choir, and she said it's everything, when the prisoners say they want to join the choir, art class, whatever, it's written down on a piece of paper, and then the prison guards have to then get that piece of paper. It's all very old-fashioned, and then go and find the prisoner and take the prisoner out and then walk them to their class or to their... and then one at a time they have to do it. So there's a lot about prisons that just isn't working in terms of giving prisoners some light at the end of the tunnel that they can rejoin society.
Well, I mean, 98% of prisoners are going to be released back into society, so we might as well try and make them better people while they're actually inside. There's always those that, are not going to get out because they've got a whole life tariff. But the reality is the vast majority come out, so we've got to make them better people. I'm not saying that we give them liberal regimes.
You see, this is what people hear, isn't it? They think that by preventing the next victim from happening, that we have to cuddle or hug a hoodie and give them a Rolls Royce and a nice flat and all these things. But the truth is that many of these prisoners come from very dark backgrounds, mental health issues that are not being addressed, that lead them to commit crime or to start on drugs. And all we're doing is perpetuating and increasing the number of victims, right, if we don't do something.
And that's the whole issue, isn't it? The issue is putting victims first. And the only way that you can reduce people being victims is by treating prisoners humanely in prison and addressing their offending behaviour so that they don't want to come back. We can make prisoners tough as anything.
See, that's what's unpopular, isn't it?
Well, it might be unpopular.
It's a very difficult message to
of course
sell.
It is. No one said it was going to be easy.
No,
I mean,
it's not easy.
I've been around for 34 years and we're still, examining what works and what doesn't work.
Listen, it's just one of those things. I once said to an audience, I said, well, look, if we gave every prisoner a salary that comes out of jail of 30 grand a year, that saves us about 30 grand a year plus. That they won't go back to prison. I mean, I was saying it just as a tester, and they were going, "No, I'd rather it cost us 60 grand than gives." And I was just using it as a ploy, but it is a very interesting thing. Just very briefly, I've been looking at the sentencing. 23% are 1 to 4 years. Again, that seems to be a very small number of years in order for the system to work for them. What would you say was the number of years that people should serve in prison if we went by the years rather than the crime?
Well, that's a difficult question.
In terms of rehabilitation. So 1 year you can't rehabilitate someone.
It's determined by the crime that they commit. I mean, I wouldn't want, a rapist or a sex offender or anyone like that who's committed heinous crimes to be given short sentences.
Actually, what I meant was, what's the perfect number for rehabilitation?
I don't think there is a perfect
underneath number. Which is there's no point. Like a year, there's going to be
Well, I'll be honest with you, all the evidence points that short-term sentencing doesn't work. So anything up to perhaps a 12-month period.
Right.
But, and this is a big but, and it's quite crucial, sometimes magistrates have tried all the community sentences and the fines and different things, and people continue to reoffend. And when they go back before the magistrate, or indeed the Crown Court, they say, well, we've been through all the options, so we're going to have to give you a prison sentence. But look, the evidence is there, right, that in Holland, Belgium, Scandinavian countries, they're making great improvements in the way that they're dealing with recidivism, criminality, and different things.
We just have to make it make sense.
And I think we do need to make it make sense, because we're just going round with a revolving door, and it's clearly not working, and it's costly for the taxpayer, and it's costly for the victims as well.
Listen, I agree with it. It's just one of those the things that people get so angry about, and I get it. Steve, will you come back? there's loads to talk about with prisons and things.
Yeah,
so if you'd, I would love that.
No problem.
Steve Gillan there, who's the General Secretary of the Prison Officers Association, and we literally just scratched the surface there. We really did. But thank you for coming in.
You're welcome.